and welcome to the first podcast for the What's Haunting the Hurst's channel. I announced this a day or so back, and I said that the first one would be on Jack the Ripper. Needless to say, if you have any familiarity at all with Jack the Ripper and all the things that occurred during that time in East London, there was a whole lot more material to cover than I expected. I'm talking pages on pages of notes I had to take because, you know, most people who do a podcast are really prepared. They have laptops, all that kind of stuff. I'm poor, so I use a piece of paper and a pen and do my research that way. There's some things I didn't know going into this about Jack the Ripper. I honestly thought that the murders took place over a longer period of time. I thought it was years and years and years worth of murders, and they were spaced out farther, but that's not the case. It happened in 1 year. The Whitechapel murders, which is what they were originally called, the Whitechapel murders. And Whitechapel was a district in the city of London. It's a very poor district, had a lot of violence, obviously a lot of poverty, prostitution, things of that sort. And all of these murders that are tied to Jack the Ripper happened in 1888. Now, before we begin, I want to talk very specifically about who we're going to be dealing with as far as the victims, because there's a lot of debate, a lot of arguments going on about who Jack the Ripper killed, how many victims he actually had. If you read some places, they'll say he had 4 victims. And they'll call those the canonical 4. And you're talking about a canon, so you think about the Bible when it was being put together, when it was completed, you had a full canon of scriptures out of all these different books. So they call these the canonical 4. These 4 people, these 4 women, were killed by Jack the Ripper, and any of the other ones, it's kind of up in the air, up for debate. You'll see a lot more than that most people believe that there's a canonical 5. Now, I personally think, just from looking at it, that the 4 option is the better option of definite Jack the Ripper victims. I think there is a canonical 4, but I believe the 5th victim is also Jack's victim, and that's Elizabeth Stride. She was the 4th, if I'm thinking right. She was the 4th victim, but there was a little bit of difference between how she was killed. Well, not how she was killed, but the aftermath of, as far as mutilation of the body, than the other ones. But there's a reason for that, and a good reason. So I think she's definitely one of the Ripper's victims. I think he had 5 victims, in my opinion. Now, the Whitechapel murders that happened around this same time have the general case file has 11 murders, and in those 11 murders are 5 Jack the Ripper victims. that we'll talk about today. Just from looking at it, I'm telling you, the police officers, and let me just say this, I'm going to say officers instead of constables. In London, they would call them constables, but I have enough trouble just talking in general without saying a word I don't generally say on a regular basis, so I'll say officers. The police officers, the police force wasn't the best in the business. I'm not saying they're horrible, but I think it was, obviously it was not what we have today, where we have DNA, all of these other things. But you also had what seemed to me incompetence in some areas, but I think it also had to do with the area that it was located in, Whitechapel. I think that maybe they didn't try as hard because of the area. I saw a lot of complaints that the police didn't offer a reward. They had reasons for that. It didn't work generally to offer a reward. People would fake evidence or just flat out, blame somebody who had nothing to do with the crime in order to collect a check. But there was rewards offered by the mayor and some private citizens to try to catch Jack the Ripper. Also, the police were under orders not to share any information with the press. That's not much different than it is today. I mean, you hear a lot of things about crimes that are happening in today's world, and the news will come out with little snippets of information, but they'll say, well, we got it from a source. It won't be an official statement. When the police want to give a statement, they'll call a press conference, but they're not going to give information out that they feel would hamper the case. And that was no different than what happened in Jack the Ripper's time. However, the people, being just people like we are, in 1888 in East London, they were starving for information. So they wanted as much information about these murders as possible. So the press was more than happy to oblige. Only problem is that the press didn't know much. So they took to shadowing police officers, follow them wherever they went, hoping to catch, any kind of information about a crime happening, so they could get there around the same time the officers would get there. They would try to bribe police officers or buy them drinks and get them drunk so they would divulge some information. Some reporters actually would dress up like women and hope that Jack the Ripper would attack them so they could come out with a sensational story, believe it or not. One thing that I did find strange reading about this whole mess was the fact that there wasn't really any police or artist sketches, crime scene artist sketches, impressions of the suspect. We did have witnesses that saw people who could have been Jack the Ripper connected to especially the last two murders. The only sketches that I was able to see were 2 sketches that were made and put out into the newspapers. And they weren't actual sketches of anything that was reported by any type of witness. They were sketches of what the newspapers at the time thought an evil killer should look like. And they put those out and said, be on the lookout. What that ultimately did was cause people to say, oh, well, I know a guy who looks just like that, and they'd turn him in. Those sketches had no basis on real people. I mean, they weren't based on actual people. They were just based on some newspaper executive's head, out of his imagination of what this killer would look like. So it was just an absolute mess. Absolute mess. So we're going to talk a little bit about the murders and the victims next. So before we go into the victims, I do want to talk about the fact that this is such a major case in the history of crime in our world. There's nobody even today that's born today, if you say Jack the Ripper, there's nobody that doesn't know what you're talking about. It's a very familiar, it's a household name over 100 years later. It was such a big deal in a world that is so obsessed, and even I've been obsessed sometimes reading about serial killers, just trying to figure out what makes them tick. It's a sociopath, psychopaths. It's terrifying that these people exist in our world. And just like today, back then, there was an interest in this type of person. But Jack the Ripper is by far the most famous of all serial killers. All of his victims were women. All of his victims are considered prostitutes, but that's a little unfair. They did prostitute. Whitechapel was such a horrible place to live. Anybody that lived under those conditions didn't have much they could do. And women, single women, some, women had children. They're trying to scrape by and live. And they resorted to certain things to make a living. And I don't think anybody should necessarily be known by what they did. It shouldn't be this person was a prostitute, this person was a woman who had a hard time, who made mistakes just like anybody else, and should never have been murdered. But yeah, this is such a big deal. There's been movies made about it. There's a movie that I love. It's called From Hell, and it has Johnny Depp in it. It's a movie I watch at least once a year. It's a very good film made about Jack the Ripper. And I want to say going into it, because if you watch that movie From Hell, or if you're familiar with it, the first person killed is a woman named Mary Tabler, and and I may have just murdered that last name, and I'll probably murder a few names in here. And it's probably bad to say murder about a murder victim, but anyway. The first victim in that movie is Mary Tabler, and she is considered by some to be Jack the Ripper's first victim. I personally do not think that Mary Tabler is a victim of Jack the Ripper. She was stabbed all over her body. In a way that's inconsistent with Jack the Ripper. Now, there are some that argue if she was his first victim, maybe he was nervous. Maybe he was excited about his first kill and just went overboard. I don't think that's what it was. I don't think Jack the Ripper was that type. I think he pretty much knew what he wanted to do and got on with it. So I'm going to go with his first victim being Mary Nichols. Mary Nichols. And I wrote it down, and I'm going to read what I have written down. Hopefully I can read my own handwriting. Mary Nichols, in the early hours of the morning on August 31st, 1888, shortly after 3:30 a.m., Charles Cross, remember that name for later on, found the body of a woman on Buck's Row after thinking it was a discarded tarp he could use for his job. Around the same time, a man named Robert Paul was walking from the same direction as Mr. Cross had been walking. Mr. Cross called him over to see what he had found. Mary was laying flat on her back, with her skirts raised over her waist. There was some debate between Charles Cross and Mr. Paul if the woman was dead, almost dead, or actually just drunk. But they fixed her skirts and agreed to tell the first officer they encountered. Neither realized or cared to realize that Mary Nichols' throat had been so violently slashed that her head was nearly severed from her body. Officer John Neal found Mary's body shortly after the two men had left the scene. The body still felt warm to the touch, but he noticed the blood oozing from her throat and that her eyes were wide open. He signaled Officer John Thane with his lantern. The officers in London at the time used these little lanterns that they could signal with and point a beam of light to. Random factoid as we go forward. So he signaled for Officer John Thane with his lantern, who promptly went for a medic. The two men who had originally discovered Mary alerted Officer Misen, who, arriving at the scene, was immediately sent for reinforcements. The doctor pronounced Mary dead shortly after 4 a.m., concluding she couldn't have been dead for more than half an hour. Jack the Ripper possibly still could have been at the scene when Charles Cross originally discovered the body. Mary Nichols was last seen alive at 2:30 a.m. by a friend, Emily Holland. Later, at the mortuary, it was found that Mary had been disemboweled. There's nobody on this earth that deserves that kind of death. And I think sometimes we get so carried away in our thoughts with the killer that we forget that that his victims were actually real people who had real mothers and fathers and siblings and friends. And Lord, just thinking about Mary Nichols and how she was treated, it's horrible. The next victim is Annie Chapman. Around 6 a.m. on the morning of September 8th, 1888. So September 8th, Mary Nichols' murder was August 31st. Not a long time after that, just 8 days. On the morning of September 8th, 1888, John Davis of 29 Hanbury Street found the mutilated body of Annie Chapman between the steps and the fence at the back of where he stayed at 29 Hanbury Street. He was so terrified that he ran out front into the street and flagged 2 men to come and help. Like Mary Nichols, Annie's clothing was pulled up above her waist. Her face and her hands were covered in blood, and it was evident by the position of her hands and her arms and the condition that they were in that she had literally fought for her life, but ultimately lost that fight. The handkerchief that she usually wore around her neck was still there. There was debate. And in fact, there was false news stories out that the handkerchief had been tied around her neck after the murder in order to keep her head attached to her body. That's not true. It's just a handkerchief she wore. One of the workers that Mr. Davis flagged, his name was James Kent, ran to get the police, but overcome by what he had seen, decided to stop for a drink instead. If you can believe it. A woman has just been murdered, laying in a pool of her own blood, and instead of getting the police, he stops and has a drink. The other worker, Henry Holland, ran and flagged an officer, but the officer informed him that it was against procedure for him to leave his post. There wasn't much concern about Annie, and that's putting it lightly. Meanwhile, James Kent, after he had finished drinking, finally made it to the police station. He flagged down Inspector Joseph Chandler, who hurried to the scene and sent for a doctor. He cleared away all the onlookers and covered the body with a sack until the doctor could arrive. When the doctor arrived at 6:30 a.m., there were around 200 onlookers. You're talking about a scene that hasn't been under control yet. 200 at least people standing around this body. Who knows the evidence that could have been trampled on and things of that sort. Didn't matter. This was a different time. But still. But when the doctor arrived, he found that her throat had been deeply cut. There were bruises all over her body. Later, it would be discovered that the killer, much like how he did with Mary Nichols, had removed her womb and some of her intestines. The doctor instructed that her body should not be touched until a full postpartum investigation could be performed on her. But 2 nurses cleaned the body and possibly cleaned off some evidence that could be needed. You're talking about a time where it was a free-for-all as far as it would be easy in certain respects to get away with murder because they didn't have very high-tech techniques like they do now. It's sad for these women. They never really had a chance. Elizabeth Stride is the third victim. Now remember, when I started the video, I talked about a canonical 4 victims. So the first 2 that we heard about, Mary Nichols and Annie Chapman, were 2 of the canonical 4. Elizabeth Stride is not part of the canon of Jack the Ripper's victims, but I believe she is very much a victim of Jack the Ripper. The reason she's not included in the canon is because she was not mutilated after the murder like the other victims were. Part of the reason for that is she was killed less than an hour before the Ripper's next victim was killed and found. So, what many believe is Jack the Ripper was rushed with Elizabeth Stride, almost caught, fled, found another victim, killed another victim in less than 15-30 minutes time, and killed 2 victims in one night. Elizabeth Stride was seen earlier in the evening with different men at different times of the day. At 12:30 a.m. on the morning of September 30th, 1888, Officer William Smith saw who he later described as Elizabeth Stride standing on the opposite side of the road at Dutfield's yard. Where her body would later be discovered. She was standing with a man. According to Officer Smith, the man was around 28 years old, had a dark complexion, and had a small, dark mustache. He was around 5'7" tall and wore a dark overcoat, a dark hat, and dark clothing. So if any of that sounds familiar, that's what you typically picture in your mind when you picture Jack the Ripper. Especially when you see Jack the Ripper art, you're always going to see a man with a dark hat, a dark overcoat, a knife in his hands, all this stuff. And that's what Officer Smith described the image of the man that was standing with Elizabeth Stride when he saw her early that evening. So he saw him, but the couple wasn't doing anything suspicious, so he let them be. A man named Israel Swartz walked onto Burner Street. Burner Street was where Dutfield's yard was located. So he walked onto Burner Street around 12:45 a.m. He noticed a man walking ahead of him. The man walked up to a woman who Israel described as Elizabeth Stride at Dutfield's yard. The man pulled, spun, and finally threw Elizabeth to the ground. Elizabeth screamed, but not loudly and not for long. A second man was standing nearby. Now, this is Israel's testimony. A second man was standing nearby. The attacker shouted, "Lipsky," to the second man. Lipsky could have been the man's name. It could have been a nickname, whatever. And the second man began to follow Israel. Israel ran off, obviously in a panic from being pursued, and lost the pursuer. The police actually found the second man that Israel described, questioned him, and said that they eliminated him as a suspect. Doesn't make sense to me. They didn't find the attacker, but they found the second man who listened to orders, according to Israel, from the attacker and pursued Israel. But this guy wasn't anything to worry about. That's what I'm talking about with the police in London at the time. But since what Israel saw, as far as the events and the finding of the body, between that, there's about 15 minutes later, 15 minutes apart, between what he saw and when the body was found. There's actually excellent likelihood that Israel saw Jack the Ripper attacking Elizabeth Stride. Israel's description of the attacker differs just a little from Officer Smith's. Officer Smith said the man was 5'7". Israel said he was 5'5". Smith said he had dark complexion. It was also night. Said he had dark complexion. Israel said the man was fair complected. Israel said the man had a small brown mustache. Officer Smith also said the man had a mustache. From what I can tell, Israel didn't mention the hat and the overcoat. But maybe the man took those off before he murdered. At 1 a.m., a man found Elizabeth's body at the site of Officer Smith's and Israel's sighting of Elizabeth Stride. Her throat was cut. Her throat was cut, and there was a large stream of blood flowing from her. The police questioned everyone on scene, did a thorough search of the area, but they were unable to find the killer. Catherine Eddowes is number 4. At about the same time that Elizabeth's body was discovered, Catherine Eddowes was being released from jail. She had been locked up earlier in the evening for public drunkenness. 3 men saw Catherine with a man after she left the jail. One got a pretty good look at him and said the man looked like a sailor, at least the way he was dressed, and composed himself. He said the man was fair complected, stood about 5'9", and had a small, fair mustache. Since Catherine's body was discovered 15 minutes later, the man probably saw the face of Jack the Ripper. I believe he saw the face of Jack the Ripper. I think Officer Smith saw the face of Jack the Ripper, and I believe Israel saw the face of Jack the Ripper. Just because there's tiny differences, I would have a hard time guessing someone's height. At night, I would definitely have a hard time guessing someone's complexion. But they all saw the mustache. They were all relatively close in height. Anyway. At 1:44 a.m., Officer Watkins walked into Mitre Square. Mitre Square is only about half a mile from where Elizabeth's body was found. So, if Jack the Ripper was in the middle of killing Elizabeth Stride, felt the heat was too hot there, got away, it wouldn't take him very long to get half a mile to kill Catherine Eddowes. Officer Watkins saw Catherine's body. This is 1:44 a.m. Just 15 minutes after, or just a few minutes after. But it says The officer walked in and saw Catherine's body. She was laying on her back, just like the rest of his victims, lying in a pool of blood. As usual, her clothes were pulled up above her waist. He ran across the square and asked for help from a retired police officer he knew that was in the area. They ran to get a doctor and received help from other officers. A search was done of the area, but the killer was not found. About an hour later, an officer found a scrap of Catherine's bloody apron on a staircase deeper in the Whitechapel district. This is very interesting because there are some people that think Jack the Ripper was from outside the White Castle area and that he came in to kill and that he would leave, come back into Whitechapel and leave. However, when the heat was on and he had just got through killing 2 people, he went deeper into White Castle. Or I keep saying White Castle. If I've said White Castle this whole time, I apologize. He would go deeper into Whitechapel, the area, which either that means he's very reckless or he very much lived in Whitechapel and was a resident. So this officer found a piece of a bloody apron. And it belonged to Catherine Eddowes. So we got our first clue from Jack the Ripper on his 4th victim. Above the apron, a message was written on the wall, and in very bad handwriting it said, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Though he wrote that, or though that was written on the wall, there's no evidence that it was Jack the Ripper that wrote it. There was no evidence that it was written at that time at all. In fact, people that saw the message said it was pretty faded, like it had been there a while. Police erased the message before the public could know about it. They didn't want to incite violence on the Jews in the area because there was a high Jewish population in the area. One fact remained, though. He did leave his first clue, and it was a piece of that bloody apron. So it seems that Jack the Ripper was a resident of Whitechapel, which means he probably wasn't a very wealthy man. Some people think that Jack the Ripper was a doctor or something like that, somebody who was very precise. Although that some people that saw the wounds and the mutilations that he did said that it wasn't very exact, that anybody could have done it. Any ruthless killer could have done this. It didn't have to be done by somebody with a great knowledge of human anatomy. Finally, Mary Kelly, victim number 5, I'm sorry. The youngest of all the victims. At 4 a.m. on the morning of November 9th, 1888, neighbors of Mary Kelly heard the faint cry of "Oh, murder," coming from where Mary Kelly lived. I'm sorry, I cannot say Mary Kelly together. Of where Mary lived. Unfortunately, crying murder was a common practice in Whitechapel. This cry went unanswered, sadly, for Mary. I don't know if they could have saved her because Jack the Ripper appeared to be a very fast killer. But they could have nonetheless found him had they maybe reacted a little faster. So that was at 4 a.m. At 10:45 a.m., Mary's landlord sent his assistant to collect Mary's overdue rent. The assistant banged on her door twice, received no answer. He looked in the window and saw blood everywhere. Mary Kelly's mutilation is so much more horrific than the other ones. They're all bad. None of them should have happened. But Mary Kelly's is so much more gruesome. I don't know if it's because she was younger. Who knows? You'd have to have the mind of a serial killer to know Jack the Ripper's thoughts and why he did what he did. But when the assistant looked in the window, he saw blood everywhere. So he ran back to the landlord, and the landlord came with him back to the apartment, opened the door, and saw the most gruesome sight that he could imagine. The wall next to the bed was covered in blood. Mind you, you can actually see the picture of this body if you Google it, if you have the stomach for it. It's an unrecognizable young lady. The wall was covered in blood. There was human flesh piled on the bedside table. On the bed laid Mary's barely recognizable carved up body. Some said when they opened the door, it looked like Mary was staring at him, because her eyes were really all that was left. In fact, it was her eyes and her teeth maybe that were used as a recognition for people that knew her, to say, yeah, that's Mary Kelly, because the rest of the body was just too carved up. They went and they sent for the police. The police were horrified as well, and they've been seeing these murders for the last few months. To end this, who was Jack the Ripper? There's a very interesting website about Jack the Ripper. Maybe I'll put a link of it in this YouTube video. You can visit it, see some of the pictures and things like that. Not necessarily of bodies, just the Whitechapel area, newspaper reports. They also have a list of suspects that you can vote on who you think is the actual killer. I have my thoughts. I voted. I saw the results so far. The number one suspect that everybody believes is the killer is a man named Aaron Kosminski. He was a top suspect of two of the top investigators at the time of the murders. Robert Anderson and Donald Swanson were those investigators. The main reason that Aaron Kosminski guy, we'll just call him Aaron. He had a lot of mental issues. In fact, he had been in the mental asylum numerous times. But the reason a lot of people think that he's number one, he lived in the area, but an officer at the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder took a shawl that belonged to Catherine Eddowes, took it, stashed it in his clothing, and took it home to his wife, just so they would have a souvenir of the Jack the Ripper killings. In 2014, that shawl went under DNA analysis and tested positive for comparative DNA of one of the descendants of Aaron Kosminski. There was a lot of people that hung it up and said, we know who Jack the Ripper is. It was Aaron Kosminski. The problem is, there's no real way to tell where that shawl had been, who had been in possession of it, if it was even really the shawl that was picked up the night of Catherine Eddowes' murder. A lot of stuff that goes into that. But he's number one just for the DNA evidence angle. I thought I wrote down something. Yeah, so another thing that was said about Aaron, the assistant police commissioner, Melville Monotton, said of Aaron Kosminski, sorry guys, this man became insane owing to many years' indulgence in solitary vices. He had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, and had strong homicidal tendencies. He was removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889, which makes him seem like a crazy homicidal maniac. He was in the area definitely in 1888 and was only sent to the asylum after the murders were finished. Not everybody says that he was a homicidal maniac, though. They did say he was crazy. Not that he was a killer, though. He's probably not somebody you want to have tea with. Don't get me wrong, but I don't think he was a killer. And my vote was for, and I'm very basic, and I think the only reason I'm choosing this guy is because of how many times I read a book and written by Patricia Cornwell called Portrait of a Killer, in which she went over all the evidence. It's a big book and it's got a lot of evidence pointing to Walter Richard Sickert, who was a famous painter, lived during this time and years later following the murders. This guy was a real piece of work. I'm telling you, if I was on the jury and Patricia Cornwell was the prosecuting attorney against Walter Richard Sickert, saying that he was Jack the Ripper, no contest, guilty. I would suggest, I would honestly recommend that book if you have an interest in these things. But that's who I voted for. That's who I think Jack the Ripper was Walter Richard Sickert. I didn't take time to write down the notes that Jack the Ripper left, because I don't honestly believe that all of the notes were from Jack the Ripper. I'm not sure that any of them were. There were two famous notes. One was the Hey Boss note, and the other one was the From Hell note, which was where they got the title for that movie that I mentioned earlier, From Hell. So, needless to say, Jack the Ripper was a evil person that killed women for whatever reason these type of people have to do these things. Nobody knows really who he is. I think he was Sickert. Some people think he's Aaron Kosminski. Number 2 on the list. In fact, Walter Richard Sickert was number 6 on this list of people that I mentioned. There was 35 names, and he was number 6. Number 1 was Aaron Kosminski, and number 2 was Charles Cross. Do you remember him? He was the guy who found the first victim, Mary Nichols. And there was some things that went into that, but I think it's pretty shaky. I think he was a genuine witness to not a witness to a crime, but a genuine witness to a crime scene. I don't think that he was actually Jack the Ripper. I could be wrong, though. After all, I'm not that smart, and I'm 100 plus years out from the crime, so that's where we're at. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm going to have stories that I'm more familiar with. I felt a little bit rushed on this, and I put that on myself. So I'm going to think of another podcast subject, and I'll announce that in the coming days. I did mention that I want to do 2 of these a week. We'll see how that goes. Hopefully I can keep up with that. But let me know in the comments or what have you, who you think the killer was. Do your own research and take a crack at it. Yeah, you'll certainly do a better job than Scotland Yard and the officers that were investigating the case in 1888. So, thank you for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one. Please like and subscribe. Let's get this channel to over 10,000 views. I think we're sitting somewhere at 50-something subscribers. Let's get a few hundred going, and tune in next time, and we'll find out what's actually haunting the Hursts. Thank you.